I want to start with a question I've been sitting with for a long time. Not a comfortable question. Not one I've fully resolved, but the kind that keeps surfacing when I'm doing something ordinary, making coffee, driving to a client meeting, watching the news, and suddenly I'm back in that bank on a Thursday afternoon in November, holding a document I'd spent 3 days writing, knowing with quiet certainty that nobody was going to read it. Here's the question. If you know something is going to hurt people, and you've said so, in writing, clearly, 3 times, and nobody listened, at what point does staying quiet and walking away become its own kind of choice, its own kind of harm? I'm not asking that rhetorically. I actually don't know the answer. I've landed in different places depending on what day you ask me, and I've been wrestling with it long enough to stop expecting a final verdict. My name is Eleanor Marsh. Most people call me Ellie. For 22 years, I was the chief risk officer at Mercier Community Bank in Greenfall, Ohio, a town of about 40,000 people, 6 bank branches, and 3 generations of local businesses that had borrowed money from us to open, expand, survive, and occasionally fail with dignity. I want to tell you what happened when a financial services holding company from Atlanta called Pinnacle Financial Group bought our bank, sent a 33-year-old chief operating officer named Connor Walsh to integrate us into their portfolio, and decided that 22 years of regional risk expertise was a legacy system that needed to be updated. I want to tell you specifically about a red binder, and I want to tell you what it cost, not me, but the people whose names were in it. That's the part that keeps me up. Let me tell you what Mercier Community Bank actually was before I explain what it became. We were not a destination bank. Nobody drove past a better branch to bank with us because of our app or our rates or because we had a slick marketing campaign. They banked with us because we knew them. We knew their businesses, their credit histories, the stories behind the numbers in ways that no standardized underwriting model could capture. When Ron Petrakis wanted to expand his HVAC company in 2009, right in the middle of the worst lending environment in 60 years, he came to us. His debt-to-income ratio looked terrible on paper, but I knew Ron. I'd reviewed his financials every year for 8 years. I knew his receivables were solid, I knew his contract backlog, and I knew that his ratio looked bad because he'd just paid off a piece of equipment 6 months early. On paper, decline. In context, approve. We approved. Ron's business is still operating. He employs 24 people. That kind of knowledge, the ability to read context that doesn't exist in a spreadsheet, is what I spent 22 years building into what we called the Mercier Commercial Risk Framework. A living document, updated 4 times a year, calibrated specifically to the economic patterns of our region, our industries, our seasonal cycles. I kept it in a red binder. Version 14. By the time Pinnacle arrived, red because I'd lost the first 2 binders and red was easier to find on a crowded shelf. Over the years it had accumulated annotations in 4 different colors of ink, coffee stains on the pages about agricultural lending, a post-it on the section about retail that said, "Do not skip this," in my own handwriting from 2019. The binder sat on the credenza behind my desk. Every loan officer in the bank knew what it was. Some of them had memorized sections of it. When Connor Walsh arrived in January, he looked at the binder and said, cheerfully, "Is that the old underwriting manual? We have a centralized system for that now. Our platform pulls directly from Pinnacle's risk engine." I said, "That's not an underwriting manual. It's a risk framework built for this specific market over 22 years. He said, right. We'll want to review legacy documentation like that as part of the integration." He wrote something on his iPad. I looked at the binder. I thought, here we go. I want to be fair to Connor Walsh. I'm going to try, because fairness matters here. He was not incompetent. He was, by any objective measure, good at his job, the job of integrating a community bank into a larger portfolio. He was efficient, he was organized, he had a clear mandate and the tools to execute it. Pinnacle's risk engine was a real system, built on real data, used across dozens of institutions. The problem was not Connor Walsh's competence. The problem was that Pinnacle's risk engine was built on national data sets, industry averages, and the kinds of patterns that appear across hundreds of markets. It was not built for Greenfall, Ohio. It was not built for the specific way that small manufacturing businesses in our region carry seasonal debt. It was not built for the particular vulnerability of our retail sector, which had been quietly hollowing out for 5 years in ways that showed differently in our local metrics than in national aggregates. It was not built for the relationship-dependent nature of our agricultural lending, where a farmer's credit score in March tells a completely different story than it does in August. I knew all of this. It was in the binder, and for the first 4 months, I tried very hard to explain it. Connor's first week, he asked to meet with department heads individually. My meeting was on a Wednesday, 35 minutes scheduled, and he arrived 7 minutes late with an energy drink and a genuinely friendly smile. He said, "Tell me how your risk process works." I told him. I was specific. I walked him through the framework, explained the regional calibration, gave him 3 examples where our local model had diverged from national standards and why that divergence had been correct. He listened. He nodded. He asked good questions, the kind that tell you someone is intelligent and processing. Then he said, "So the Pinnacle platform would handle most of this automatically. It updates quarterly based on national data." I said, "Our framework updates quarterly based on local data. That's a meaningful difference in a market like ours." He said, "I hear you. Let's schedule a deeper integration review and get the right people together to look at this." We scheduled the review. The review happened 5 weeks later. The right people were 2 analysts from Pinnacle's operations team in Atlanta who had been doing bank integrations for 3 years. They were thorough. They were professional. They looked at our loss rates, our approval rates, our default history. Our default rate was 1.2%. The national community bank average was 2.8%. The Atlanta analyst looked at this and said, "You're either being too conservative or your market is unusually stable." I said, "We're calibrated to our market. That's the point." They said, "Pinnacle's model would actually allow you to increase your approval rate while maintaining risk targets. There's significant unrealized lending capacity here." I said, "We've deliberately been conservative on certain sectors because of specific local conditions I've documented in detail." They wrote something down. Then they said, "We'll flag this for Connor." The meeting ended. I went back to my office. I opened the red binder to the retail section, to the post-it that said, "Do not skip this," to the 3 years of data I'd compiled about the hollowing pattern in our local retail sector, the specific vulnerability of multi-location, small retail businesses that looked viable on national benchmarks but had a failure rate in our region nearly twice the national average. I wrote a memo, 3 pages, single-spaced. Specific numbers, specific case examples, specific projections, titled Regional Retail Sector Risk Divergence from National Model, Mercier Market. I sent it to Connor, with copies to the 2 Atlanta analysts and our regional compliance officer. 2 days later, Connor replied, "Thanks, Ellie. Flagged for our Q2 model review. The team will take a look." That was February. In March, Connor announced the formal transition to Pinnacle's integrated risk platform. The rollout would be complete by May. The Mercier Commercial Risk Framework would be archived as historical documentation. Archived. I went to see Connor. I said, "I want to be specific about what archiving that framework means. It means the retail sector data doesn't get applied to new loan decisions." He said, "The Pinnacle model covers retail risk." I said, "With national data. I have 22 years of local data showing that national retail models systematically underestimate failure risk in our specific market." He said, "Ellie, I appreciate how much you've built here. I really do. But we need to operate on a consistent platform across the portfolio. That's non-negotiable from the parent company's perspective." I looked at him. He was being genuine. Not dismissive genuine. He actually believed the system was better. That's the thing I want you to understand about Connor Walsh. He wasn't ignoring my data because he was arrogant or lazy. He was making a rational decision within the constraints he'd been given, with the information he trusted more than mine because it came from a larger sample size. He was wrong. But not in the way that makes a satisfying story. He was wrong in the way that institutional systems are often wrong not through malice, but through a failure of translation between scales. I went back to my office. I sat down in my chair, the same chair I'd been sitting in for 15 years, with the specific creak on the right side that I'd never gotten around to fixing. I opened the binder. I turned to the page about Kowalski Home Garden Supply. A family-owned hardware and garden supply chain, 6 locations in our region, customers for 11 years. I'd reviewed their financials every year. I'd declined their last 3 loan applications because their debt load against their revenue trajectory showed a specific pattern I'd seen before, a business expanding faster than its market could support. I knew what was going to happen when they reapplied under the new system. I knew what Pinnacle's model was going to see. A multi-location regional retailer, solid collateral, acceptable debt to income by national averages, 11-year banking relationship. I knew what Pinnacle's model was not going to see. The specific hollowing pattern I'd documented. The way their expansion into a 4th location in 2021 had actually weakened rather than strengthened their position. The particular vulnerability of their product mix to the online migration patterns I'd been tracking since 2019. I opened my laptop. I wrote another memo. This one was 4 pages. The subject line was, Kowalski Home and Garden specific risk concerns under new underwriting framework. I laid out everything, every number, every pattern, every reason why the Pinnacle model was going to see a different business than the one that actually existed in our market. I sent it to Connor, with copies to the regional compliance officer and the head of commercial lending. I got an automated acknowledgement from Connor's calendar system. Nothing else. That was April. In May, the Pinnacle platform went live. The Mercier Commercial Risk Framework was archived in a shared drive under a folder called Legacy Documentation, Pre-Integration. In June, Kowalski Home and Garden Supply applied for a business expansion loan. The Pinnacle model approved it. I found out from Marcus Webb, our senior commercial loan officer, who called me on a Tuesday afternoon. He said, "Ellie, the Kowalski application came through." I said, "I know." He said, "The system approved it." I said, "I know." Silence. He said, "You wrote 2 memos about this." I said, "I know." He said, "What do we do?" I thought about it for a long time. Then I said, "Marcus, you followed the process. The system made the decision. There's nothing procedurally wrong with this." He said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "I know." I hung up. I sat in my office for a while, looking at the red binder on my credenza. Then I did something I'd never done in 22 years of this work. I opened the binder to the first page, the page with the original framework rationale I'd written in 2002, when our then president asked me to explain why our approval process was slower than the industry average. I'd written, "Speed in credit decisions is a feature of a system optimized for volume. Accuracy in credit decisions is a feature of a system optimized for outcomes. These are different systems serving different purposes." I read that page. Then I closed the binder. I opened my email. I wrote a resignation letter. It was 11 sentences. I thanked the institution. I noted the date of my last day. I indicated my willingness to assist with documentation transfer. I didn't mention the memos. I didn't mention the Kowalski loan. I didn't explain. I submitted it on a Thursday afternoon and went home. I had driven past the main branch of Mercier Community Bank every day for 22 years. The next morning, I drove a different route. Here is what nobody prepares you for when you leave a job you've held for 22 years. It's not the adjustment to the schedule, or the financial calculations, or even the specific grief of losing a professional identity you've held for most of your adult life. It's the silence. I had expected to feel something clarifying when I left. Either the clean satisfaction of having done the right thing, or the clean pain of a clean loss. What I got instead was a long, quiet ambiguity that didn't resolve into either. I took 3 weeks off before I started thinking about what came next. I cleaned out the garage. I repainted the kitchen. I called my sister in Columbus and had 3 different conversations about the same thing that always ended in the same place. "You did what you could, Ellie," which was true, also insufficient. The red binder was in a box in my home office. I hadn't opened it since the last day. I'd brought it because it was mine. The framework was based on my work, my analysis, my years of pattern recognition. Nobody asked for it back when I left. It wasn't in any system they understood how to access. I thought about that a lot. In August, I got a call from a former colleague, not Marcus, someone from the compliance side who told me, carefully, professionally, that 2 other commercial loans approved under the new framework had shown early delinquency indicators. She wasn't asking me for anything. She just wanted me to know. I said, "Are they flagging it with Connor?" She said, "The flags are in the system. Connor gets the automated reports." I said, "And?" She said, "He's handling it through the standard remediation protocol." I said, "Which assumes a certain recovery trajectory that doesn't fit our market's patterns." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's what I thought you'd say." I sat with that call for a long time. I was not glad. I want to be specific about that. I was not glad that I had been right. Being right about a bad outcome is not satisfaction. It's a particular kind of grief that comes with being a risk officer for 22 years. You get good at seeing failure coming. You don't get used to seeing it arrive. Here's the part of this story that I've thought about most carefully. Nothing happened automatically. There was no trigger, no mechanism, no version of events where I pressed a button and watched justice arrive on schedule. What happened was slower and messier and more human than that. By October, 4 months after I left, Marcus Webb called me again. He said, "Ellie, Kowalski's filing." I knew what he meant. Chapter 11, most likely. The specific kind of business bankruptcy that means we're trying to restructure but often means we're in the early stages of a longer decline. I said, "When?" He said, "Last week. There are 3 others in similar positions." I said, "The retail portfolio." He said, The retail portfolio. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "How is everyone at the bank?" He said, "Worried. There's going to be a review. Pinnacle is sending people." I said, "I know." He said, "Connor's still there." I said, "I know." He said, "The question that keeps coming up in conversations I'm not supposed to be having with you, Ellie, is, was any of this in writing?" I said, 4 memos, dated, with copy receipts. The full framework documentation is in the archive." He was quiet. I said, "Marcus, that's not for the purpose of blame. It's for the purpose of learning. Whatever review happens, the record is accurate." He said, "Diane Kowalski came in yesterday. She'd been with the bank for 11 years. I didn't respond immediately." He said, "She was trying to understand how the loan decision was made. She asked for the loan officer's notes. She asked if anyone had flagged concerns before approval." I thought about Diane Kowalski, who I had met twice, who ran 6 stores and employed at peak 42 people, who had a reputation in the region for treating employees well. I said, "What did she look like?" He said, "Like someone trying to figure out if she could have done something different." I said, "The answer is no. She did everything right." That conversation stayed with me for days. I want to stop here and say something that I think is important. I've been told this is a story about institutional knowledge being replaced by corporate standardization, and it is. I've been told it's a story about a risk officer who was right and wasn't listened to, and that's also true. But the story I keep finding myself in is actually about Diane Kowalski, not about me. Diane Kowalski didn't borrow money she couldn't afford. She applied to a bank she'd trusted for 11 years, a bank that had previously declined her applications precisely because someone was doing the hard work of understanding her actual risk profile. The new system looked at her file and saw a viable business. The new system was wrong, and Diane Kowalski is paying for that mistake in ways that have nothing to do with whether I was right. That's the part that keeps me up. In November, I got the call I'd been expecting. Pinnacle Financial Group's Director of Regional Operations. Professional voice, careful language. They were conducting a review of the integration process at Mercier. They had noted the archived risk documentation. They had noted the memos. He said, "We'd like to bring you on as a consultant for the remediation process. We think your market expertise would be valuable." I sat with that offer for a week. I'm going to be honest with you about my reaction. There was a version of me that wanted to say no. That felt like going back, even in an advisory capacity, was handing something to people who hadn't earned it. That the correct response was to let them learn this lesson without me. I thought about that version of me for several days. I sat with her. And then I thought about Diane Kowalski sitting across from Marcus Webb, asking if anyone had flagged concerns before the approval. Here is what I decided. I called Pinnacle's Director of Regional Operations back. I said, "I'll work with you on the remediation. But I need to be specific about the terms. My work will focus on the affected commercial clients, the people who are currently trying to restructure their loans. I will provide market analysis to help those clients work through viable restructuring paths. I will not advise on how Pinnacle should present this publicly or manage the regulatory optics." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's not quite the scope we had in mind." I said, "I know, but it's the scope I can do with integrity." Another silence. He said, "Let me take that back to the team." He called back 2 days later. He said, "We can work with that. I want to be specific about what I did over the next 4 months, because I think the specifics matter more than the summary." I met individually with 11 commercial clients who had loans approved under the new framework that were now showing stress. I wasn't there to represent Pinnacle. I was there as someone who had spent 22 years understanding their businesses, their markets, their patterns. In some cases, I helped them build restructuring proposals that were realistic, not optimistic on paper, but dishonest about their trajectory, the way these documents often end up. In some cases, I sat across from people and said, gently and directly, "This business is not going to survive in its current form. Here is what I think you should do." Diane Kowalski was one of those conversations. We sat in a conference room at a location that was not the Mercier Bank neutral ground, her request. She had printouts of financials I recognized from her previous loan applications. She had the binder that her accountant had put together for the restructuring proposal. She looked at me and said, "Were you the one who declined my applications before the new system?" I said yes. She said, "Why?" I told her. Not the version that protects anyone's feelings. The specific, accurate version. The expansion pattern. The market data. The structural vulnerability of her product mix. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "So you knew?" I said, "I knew there was a specific risk profile, I didn't know what decision you would make. I didn't know the new system would approve the loan. I wrote it down. She said, "But you left." I said, "Yes." She was quiet. I want to tell you that she was angry. It would make the story cleaner. But she wasn't angry, exactly. She looked more like someone doing a difficult calculation. She said, "If you had stayed, would it have made a difference?" I thought about that question honestly. I said, "I don't know, maybe not. The system was approved at a level above my influence, but I would have had more opportunities to make the case." She said, "So maybe." I said, "Maybe." She said, "Okay." That was the whole conversation about fault. She moved on to the restructuring numbers. She was practical, she was clear-eyed, and she made decisions in that meeting that I thought were the right ones. 3 of her 6 stores survived the restructuring. 3 closed. 42 people, at peak. The number that came out of the restructuring was closer to 21. I go back to that number sometimes. I'm going to tell you what I do now, because I think it matters. I run a regional risk consulting practice. I work with community banks, credit unions, and local commercial lenders across the Great Lakes region. I advise on the specific problem of applying standardized risk models to markets where local conditions diverge meaningfully from national patterns. I have 5 clients. I have a wait list. The red binder is on my desk at home. I've added to it. It's on version 17 now, covering not just Greenfall but 4 additional markets. The cover is new. I had to replace it when the original fell apart, but I kept the original post-it, the one that says "Do not skip this," and taped it inside the new front cover. I hear from Marcus Webb occasionally. He's still at Mercier, now under a somewhat restructured relationship with Pinnacle. They've adjusted their integration model for community banks after what happened. Slightly, in ways that I'm told are meaningful in certain areas and performative in others. Connor Walsh was reassigned to a different portfolio 6 months after the review concluded. I don't know where. I don't think he's a villain in this story. I think he's someone who had a specific set of tools and a specific mandate and genuinely believed he was helping. I think about him sometimes the way you think about systems, not people. Exactly. But not people either. Diane Kowalski, the 3 surviving stores are still operating. She called me in March to tell me that she was expanding the garden supply section of 2 of them, cautiously, based on a regional analysis I'd helped her commission. She asked if I wanted to see the data. I said yes. I want to end with the question I opened with, because I still don't have a clean answer, and I think you deserve to know that. If you know something is going to hurt people, and you've said so clearly 3 times, and nobody listened, at what point does walking away become its own kind of harm? Here's where I've landed, provisionally. Walking away was right. Staying in a system I couldn't influence would not have helped Diane Kowalski more than leaving did. The memos are in the record. The framework is documented. What I know is not gone. But walking away was right, and walking away was sufficient are not the same thing. I could have pushed harder. I could have escalated higher. I could have been louder, more disruptive, more willing to be the difficult person in the room. I chose not to, partly because I believed in process and partly because, I'll be honest about this, I was tired. 22 years of being the person who says, here's what the data actually shows in rooms where people want to hear something easier is exhausting in specific ways. I don't know if a louder version of me would have changed the outcome. I think probably not, but I hold that uncertainty. Here's what I do know. The work was real. The framework was accurate. When Diane Kowalski sat across from me and asked if I'd known, the answer was yes, and that mattered to her, and it should have mattered earlier to more people. That's the thing about knowing something. It doesn't protect you from being ignored, but it also doesn't go away. 22 years of understanding how this market works is not in a database anywhere except the red binder on my desk and the one in my head. Nobody can archive that. Nobody can migrate it to a new platform or standardize it out of existence. It lives where it lives, and the next time someone needs it, I'm going to be here. If this story resonated with you, if you've been in a room where you knew something that nobody wanted to hear, leave a comment. I mean that. These conversations matter. And if you haven't subscribed yet, take a second to do that. It helps us keep making space for stories that don't fit cleanly in a 3-act structure. Take care of yourselves, trust what you've built, and keep the documentation.